A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 34, Shadow of the Usurper. The War Council, the weight of the Haliacman. The air inside the royal pavilion was stifling, thick with the scent of unwashed wool and the sharp medicinal odor of burnt resin. A massive map of the Haliacman basin lay stretched across the center table, held down by heavy bronze daggers. Iphicrates stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the map. To his left, the Theban general Ismenias stood motionless, his posture reflecting the rigid geometric discipline of his city. Across from them sat the Macedonian inner circle, a tense collection of veterans and courtiers. Old Italus sat slumped in a chair, his face a map of old scars, his eyes tracking the Athenian's finger with deep skepticism. Parmenion, steady and immovable, studied the terrain with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Antipater, ever the cautious administrator, stood slightly behind, his mind clearly cataloging the dwindling grain stores and the vulnerability of the supply lines. The geometry is absolute, Ismenias stated, his voice devoid of emotion. We hold the center, we force the northern tribes into the river's bend, and we crush them with the depth of our phalanx. It is the only path to a clean victory. Old Italus let out a dry, rasping laugh. The river is not a chalkboard Theban. It moves. It floods. And the northern tribes don't fight in squares. We are not here to debate the nature of the river, Iphicrates interrupted, his tone sharp. We are here to ensure the king's safety, while we execute the maneuver. Philip, positioned near the back, watched the interplay with cold focus. He noted that while young Italus and the regent had remained behind in Pella to hold the capital, a tactical necessity he begrudgingly understood, they had attended the final council via messengers and letters. Their presence felt in the specific, cautious instructions regarding the royal baggage train. Parmenion stepped forward, pointing to a narrow crossing point on the map. If the tribes force the center, the baggage train is exposed. Our allies have surrounded it with trenches, but that also traps us in place if we need to retreat. We do not retreat, Ismenias countered firmly. Antipater leaned in, his voice low. We do not have the supplies to endure a long siege in this valley. We win here, or we do not win at all. Philip felt a sudden surge of clarity. He looked at the faces around the table. The Athenian strategist, the rigid Theban, the loyal, weathered Macedonian generals, and the cautious administrator. They were all arguing over the shape of the battle, but none of them spoke of the chaos that would inevitably follow once the first line broke. They are all so focused on their formations, Philip thought, his eyes shifting from the map to the faces of the men who would lead his people to glory or to the grave. They are crafting a masterpiece of war, but they are all ignoring the fact that the canvas is rotting underneath them. He looked at the empty space where young Italus and the regent should have been, then at his brother, the king, who stared at the map with a dazed, hollow expression. The meeting was a symphony of professional opinions, but for Philip, it was a confirmation of his deepest fear. His kingdom was being managed by experts who were building a house of cards, and he was the only one in the tent who realized the wind was already starting to howl. Campaign Day 1. The morning sun broke over Pella, but it brought no warmth to the stone walls of the palace. Instead, the air was thick with the dust of an empire in motion. The departure was not the crisp, efficient mobilization of a veteran army, but the cumbersome, labored exodus of a royal court, suddenly terrified of the shadow approaching from the north. The royal caravan, a sprawling, rattling city of wood, canvas, and velvet, began to pour out of the capital's gates. Eurydice paused at the step of the lead carriage, her hand trembling as she gripped the gilded railing. The memory of the previous night's discord in her chamber, the sharp, cold defiance in Philip's eyes, the hollow fatigue of Perdiccas clung to her like a shroud. She felt as though she were boarding a funeral barge rather than a royal transport. Eurydice hurried up behind her, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the distant horizon where the northern threat lay hidden. She clutched a small bag of talismans to her chest, her knuckles white. "Must we go, mother?" Eurydice whispered, her voice cracking. The air feels tainted, like a bad omen caught in the dust. If we stay, we are abandoned, Eurydice thought, forcing a mask of composure onto her features as she stepped into the swaying dark of the cabin. If we go, we are the meat placed before the wolves. Gods, why did I allow him to persuade me? We go because the throne exists where the king stands, Eurydice replied, her voice steadying only by force of will. She sank onto the velvet cushions, the fabric feeling suffocatingly soft against the grim reality of the war march. Do not let the servants see your fear, Euryno. If they see us tremble, the entire court will shatter before we even reach the Hiketeia. Euryno climbed in beside her, the heavy curtains falling shut with a final, sickening thud. The interior of the carriage was dimly lit, the scent of expensive incense battling the acrid smell of the dust rising from the city gates. I'm not afraid of death, Euryno mused, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I'm afraid of the silence that will follow if Philip is right, if we are all that remains of the Argead name. What if we are merely dragging our own heads to the chopping block? Mother, Euryno ventured again, leaning close. Philip is so certain. He believes in the courtesy of war. Does he not know that war knows no mercy? When the lines break, will they look for the queen, or will they simply burn the carriage? Eurydice reached out, gripping her daughter's hand so hard her fingernails bit into the skin. She is right, the queen thought, the terror she had suppressed, all night finally surfacing in the cold, hollow ache in her stomach. The generals are playing a game of numbers. They do not care about the women in the gilded boxes. We are not passengers. We are hostages to a victory we cannot guarantee. We pray, Eurydice said, her gaze fixed on the swaying shadows of the carriage walls. We pray that the generals are as brilliant as they claim, and that Philip is a better student than he is a son. Because if he is wrong, Euryno, the history of our house will be written in the mud of the Hiketeia. As the caravan lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cobblestones, both women sat in the stifling dark, trapped in a gilded cage that felt more like a tomb with every passing mile. Outside, the sounds of the march intensified, the rhythmic thud of marching boots, the clatter of baggage carts, and the distant, mocking call of a hawk circling above the doomed procession. From the sheltered gloom of the palace portico, Queen Gygia stood draped in charcoal-hued wool, her gaze tracking the rhythmic, serpentine exit of the army from Pella. Nearby, the spared princes, Archelaus, Argead, and Menelaus, stood as silent observers, watching the swirling dust rise in thick, suffocating plumes. Gygia remained motionless, her features a study in icy, regal detachment, though her eyes followed the flash of the royal standards with a piercing, calculated intensity. She understood the gravity of the exodus. She knew that once the last soldier faded into the horizon, a vacuum would settle over the palace, the true theater for the inheritance of the Argead line. Argead leaned against a fluted marble pillar, his fingers trailing over the cold, unyielding stone. He watched the infantry, the expendable souls of the impending conflict, trudge past in a grim, uneven rhythm. His voice was a thin, wistful murmur that barely breached the grinding din of the iron-rimmed wheels. I wish I could be among them, Argead murmured, his focus fixed on the distant sun-drenched glint of his brother's armor. Archelaus shifted his weight, his expression hardening into a sharp, cynical mask. To serve as a mere piece on a board you don't command, he replied without turning his head. It is far wiser to remain here, where the earth is at least stable beneath our feet. They are venturing toward a destiny that leaves no space for us, brother. They are riding to see if a crown can be secured in the mire of the riverbank. Menelaus stayed mute, arms folded across his chest, his gaze trailing the rear guard. He seemed to be tallying the spears, assessing the strength of the host that was currently stripping the palace of its martial marrow. Gygia rotated slowly, her gaze sweeping over the three of them, a silent, chilling appraisal of their utility. Do not lament your distance from the front, she declared, her voice a low, melodic edge of steel. They are engaged in a game of blood and blade. Should they prevail, they will return irrevocably altered, forged in the heat of the Hiketeia. But if they fall, she allowed the silence to stretch, heavy with unspoken potential. Then the true campaign will ignite here, within these stone confines, and it will demand far more than a simple soldier's spear to prevail. She pivoted back to the road, watching until the final cavalcade dissolved into the heat haze. The princes stood as three silhouettes against the brightening sky, witnessing the disintegration of their former existence and the sharp, uncertain birth of a new reality. From the gloom of the palace gatehouse, the regent observed the procession with a stoicism that masked a profound, churning unease. Beside him, young Attalus stood with arms crossed, his focus locked on the swaying curtains of the royal carriages, while Antipater scrutinized the ledger for the third time, his brow knitted in meticulous calculation. It was an agonizing, sluggish crawl. Wagons burdened with state records, sacred temple gold, and the ornate, gilded appointments of the nobility groaned under their own mass, their heavy wheels carving deep furrows into the parched soil. Behind the heavy transport followed the noble retinue. High-ranking courtiers on horseback, their complexions pale and set in grim, unyielding masks, carriages carrying the royal women shrouded by thick drapery, and a relentless train of scribes and attendants bearing the administrative lifeblood of the realm. It looks less like an army and more like a procession of the condemned, young Attalus remarked, his voice barely rising above the screech of a stressed axle. They are transporting our entire future on those splintering wheels, he thought, a wave of nausea rising in his gut. If the Haliacmen proves their undoing, there will be nothing left in Pella to command. Only a vacant throne and the scavengers. Antipater did not glance up from his scroll. The baggage is too cumbersome, the tempo is too lethargic, and the logistical demand is a warrant for disaster. But the king requires a witness, and the queen insists on the court's presence to project the illusion of control. Illusion is the precise term, the regent mused, watching the royal carriage vanish into a cloud of grit. They are walking into a snare, and we are left to garrison a hollow shell. If Perdiccas is lost, this kingdom perishes with him. And if the youth commits a fatal error, the dynasty evaporates along with the caravan. They are leaving us to defend the threshold against a coming tide, young Attalus added, his eyes tracing the line of the baggage train until it melted into the shimmering horizon. Do you truly expect they will return, or are we merely awaiting the courier who brings word that we are kings of a wasteland? Antipater finally rolled his scroll, his face an impenetrable mask. I believe that statecraft is a ledger, Attalus, and today the accounts are tilted heavily toward the abyss. They are so incredibly fragile, the regent thought, his gaze lingering on the last of the royal guards exiting the gate. The king's vanity, the queen's desperation, the prince's hubris, everything is currently rattling along that road toward the river. We remain to manage the stillness, but I fear the stillness is already upon us. He turned away from the gate, the dust of the departing column settling on his garments like fine ash. Close the gates, he ordered, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. We have a kingdom to preserve until the tidings reach us from the Haliacmen. From his vantage point near the gate, Philip watched the procession with a cold, detached intensity. He felt the grinding vibration of the wheels in the soles of his boots. It looked less like a military campaign and more like a solemn cortege for a dynasty that hadn't yet realized it was dead. Behind him, the steady, rhythmic thud of sandals against the stone signaled his brother's approach. King Perdiccas III moved with a labored gait, his ceremonial breastplate catching the morning sun, though the metal seemed to hang loosely on his frame. Beside him walked old Attalus, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his eyes scanning the horizon with the wary habit of a man who had seen too many kings die in the dirt. They move as if they are marching to a wedding, not a war, Perdiccas muttered, his voice brittle. He watched a cart loaded with the royal archives lurch dangerously over a rut. Every revolution of those wheels is a day closer to the end, he thought, a cold sweat pricking his neck. I'm the king of this parade, yet I feel like the prisoner in the lead cage. I have to be there, I have to be, but the gods are screaming at me to turn back. Old Attalus spat on the ground, his gaze lingering on the Athenian vanguard, now merging with the rear of the column. It is not a wedding, my king. It is a sacrifice. The baggage is too heavy, and the royals are far too visible. If the northern tribes don't gut us, the fatigue will. The boy sees too much, Attalus mused, catching Philip's rigid posture out of the corner of his eye. He watches the movement of these carts, not with the wonder of a prince, but with the calculation of a master. He thinks he knows the cost of this expedition, but he hasn't yet smelled the rot of a battlefield left too long in the sun. The generals insist on the formation, Perdiccas said, his eyes darting to the Athenian officers riding near the front. Iphicrates says the geometry requires the baggage to be centered. Iphicrates says whatever keeps his neck safe, Attalus countered, his voice a low rasp. He's protecting his supply lines, not your throne. If the line breaks, he will cut the baggage loose to save his own men. You are merely the cargo he's forced to escort. Philip turned then, his face unreadable. Then why allow it? If we know they are treating us like baggage, why are we acting like they're hostages? Perdiccas looked at his younger brother, a flash of defensive bitterness crossing his face. Because it is the only way to hold the army together, Philip. Without the Athenians, we are just a collection of noble houses fighting over a corpse. We need the spectacle of the crown to make the march. He's right, and that is exactly why he is doomed, Attalus thought, feeling the weight of his own years. He trades the safety of the dynasty for the appearance of it. The spectacle is a target, Philip replied, his voice chillingly calm. He looked back at the caravan, where the gilded curtains of the queen's carriage swayed in the morning breeze. If we are going to be the centerpiece of this battle, brother, we should at least ensure we are the ones holding the sword, not the ones waiting to be carved. Perdiccas didn't answer. He only stared at the long, snaking line of the caravan, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the hilt of his ceremonial blade. He could see his own reflection in the bronze, a tired, haunted young man, and for a fleeting moment he saw exactly what Philip saw, a procession of the condemned, and a king who had nowhere left to hide. Every time a cart axle shrieked or a horse balked at the clutter, the entire line ground to a halt, triggering a cascade of curses from the sweating guards and the impatient mule drivers. The army of soldiers waiting to flank this mess, the seasoned, iron-willed mercenaries and the disciplined phalanxes, looked at the chaotic baggage train with barely concealed disdain. To the professional, this caravan was an anchor. To the royals, it was their entire world. It was a city in upheaval, a microcosm of Pella dragged into the dirt. Beside the creaking supply wagons marched the backbone of the household. The cooks, their white tunics stained by wood smoke and river mud, guarding crates of precious oil and dry salt. The healers and physicians, their satchels clinking with the grim tools of their trade, saws, cauterizing irons, and linen strips that would never be enough for the wounds to come. Mothers carried infants slung in coarse wool, their eyes wide with the terror of displacement, while young servants scampered beneath the axles to retrieve fallen bundles of fodder, their small hands calloused and raw. Women of the noble households walked amidst the throng, their fine-spun veils snagging on thorns, their dignity fraying with every mile of dust. They were accompanied by a legion of helpers, water carriers, scribes with ink-stained fingers, and personal attendants who hauled chests of bedding and vanity mirrors, as if they could preserve some shred of the life they had been forced to abandon. The air was thick with the competing odors of this itinerant life. The metallic stench of the soldiers' bronze, the sweet, heavy scent of baking bread from the portable ovens, and the underlying sour tang of fear that clung to the thousands of non-combatants. They are not just baggage, Philip thought, watching a cook desperately trying to keep a crate of spices from tipping into a muddy rut. They are the memories of our kingdom. If this column is broken, it is not just the treasury that bleeds. It is the entire culture of Pella that is ground into the Haliacman mud. The soldiers watched them with a mix of pity and frustration. To the mercenaries, these civilians were a soft, pathetic weight that threatened the army's mobility. They didn't see the mothers or the healers. They saw an obstacle to their tactical maneuvers, a mass of terrified flesh that would inevitably get in the way when the arrows began to fly. But as the caravan groaned forward, the sheer scale of the human tide was undeniable, a desperate, sprawling, moving city that was betting its survival entirely on the thin, shivering line of iron protecting its perimeter. As the last of the royal household passed through the gates, the city of Pella felt suddenly hollow behind them. They were heading toward the Haliacman, but as Philip watched the slow, agonizing pace of their exit, he realized they weren't just marching toward a battle. They were dragging their vulnerabilities out into the open. A feast laid out for any wolf patient enough to wait for the caravan to tire. Campaign day to Axios Laudius mouth. By the second day, the march had brought the sprawling caravan to the humid, marshy delta where the Axios and Laudius rivers bled into the Thermaic Gulf. The air here was heavy with the briny tang of the sea and the scent of stagnant river mud. Anchored in the shallows was the Athenian fleet, a forest of masts and bleached sailcloth that seemed to dwarf the shoreline. Iphicrates moved through the chaos with the cold, restless energy of a man who viewed the world as a logistics problem. He was everywhere at once, his voice cutting through the humid air as he directed the transfer of heavy stores from the triremes to the waiting mule trains. Eurydice, peering through the parted curtains of the carriage, felt the breath hitch in her throat. She had never seen such a gathering of power. It was a spectacle that defied the limits of her imagination. The ship stretched across the horizon like a singular gargantuan beast, their prows cutting into the gray water with a predatory grace. The sheer scale of the masts, reaching toward the clouds like a forest of spears, left her momentarily paralyzed. It is magnificent, she thought, her eyes widening as the sunlight caught the rigging, turning the sails into a blinding, ethereal white. It is as if the gods themselves have descended to pull the sea onto the land. But as she watched the Athenian marines, hard-faced men with bronze skin and eyes that looked through the Macedonian servants as if they were ghosts, the awe shifted into a cold, prickling dread. The fleet was not here to serve, it was here to loom. They are too big, she realized, a shiver chasing the warmth from her skin. They are so vast that they make Pella look like a child's toy. If they can build this, what hope does a simple wagon train have? She pulled back into the shadows of the carriage, clutching her skirts. She had wanted to see the alliance's strength, but looking at that wall of timber and cordage, she felt only the crushing weight of their dependence. The spectacle was not a promise of victory. It was a reminder of their own insignificance, a terrifying display of power that made the entire Macedonian court look like an afterthought in their own theater of war. The rendezvous turned the caravan's sluggish pace into a crawl. The transition was a logistical nightmare. Crates of Athenian weaponry, amphorae of wine, and salted rations were dragged from the hulls of the ships, clogging the narrow riverbank paths. Soldiers of the Athenian vanguard, clad in polished bronze, stood with arms crossed, watching the Macedonian royal household with open condescension as they struggled to maneuver their velvet-curtained carriages through the churned-up river mud. A few paces away, old Attalus stood near the water's edge, his boots sinking into the dark, brackish muck. He watched the Athenian sailors toss supply crates onto the shore with a casual disregard for their contents. His hand hovered near his sword, his knuckles stiff with suppressed rage. "Look at them," Attalus growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They treat our capital's arrival as if we were a nuisance in their loading yard." Parmenion stood beside him, his expression an impenetrable mask of military focus. He watched the lines of the Athenian marines, noting the quality of their armor and the disciplined silence they maintained, even while the Macedonians devolved into shouting matches over bogged-down wagons. "They are not just loading supplies, Attalus," Parmenion said softly. "They are measuring us. Every crate moved, every carriage that stalls in the mud, they are cataloging our weakness. They don't see an alley, they see a liability that needs to be managed. They see the fragility of a kingdom that cannot move its own court without chaos," Parmenion thought, his eyes tracking the way the Athenian soldiers deliberately cleared a path for their own gear, while leaving the royal wagons to struggle in the deep ruts. If Iphicrates decides the baggage is too heavy to carry to the Hiketeia, he won't ask for permission to discard it. He will simply burn it. A short distance away, the Theban commander Ismenias stood with his arms folded across his chest, observing the scene with a cold, analytical detachment. He did not look at the royal carriages with the disdain of the Athenians. He looked at them as one might observe a malfunctioning piece of machinery. "It is inefficient," Ismenias remarked to the air, though his target was clearly the struggling Macedonian line. A royal house that cannot organize its own baggage will struggle to hold a tactical line. "They bring their softness to the field of war," Ismenias mused, his mind already recalculating the army's march speed. "If they cannot navigate a delta, how will they fare when the northern tribes close the trap? They are a vacuum of competence. When the blood begins to flow, this entire train will be the first thing the enemy crushes." Old Attalus spat into the mud near Ismenias' feet, a gesture of defiance that the Theban ignored. "It is not inefficiency, Theban. It is history. We are dragging our past into the mud so we might survive long enough to have a future." "Then you should have left the past in Pella," Ismenias replied, his voice devoid of heat. "At the Hiketeia, only the present matters, and in the present you are currently drowning in your own baggage." Attalus didn't respond. He simply watched as a wheel on the queen's carriage gave a sickening crack, causing the entire column to shudder and stop once more. He looked at Parmenion, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on the Athenian fleet, the beautiful looming wall of wood that held their lifeblood. yet remained entirely out of reach, anchored in the deep water, watching the allies struggle in the dirt. Philip spent the day at the edge of the camp watching the ships. He saw the way Iphicrates' officers pointed toward the royal baggage, not with the respect due to a king, but with the appraising eyes of men inspecting spoils. They see the fragility, Philip realized, his hands tightening on the hilt of his practiced blade until his knuckles turned bone white. They see that we are not a sovereign army. We are a traveling treasure house guarded by desperate men. The Athenians don't look at our supplies and see provisions for the front. They see the wealth of a kingdom that is failing to protect its own throat. A shadow fell over him, and the scent of sea salt and aged leather announced Iphicrates before the general even spoke. The Athenian did not look at the ships. He looked at the sprawling, muddy mess of the royal court. "Your father's house is a heavy thing to carry into the mud, Prince," Iphicrates said, his tone deceptively conversational. He stood with his hands tucked into his belt, watching a group of Macedonian servants struggle to heave a crate of silver plate from the mire. Philip didn't turn his head. "It is the weight of a kingdom, General. Perhaps it is too heavy for you to understand, accustomed as you are to ships that carry only what can be stolen or sold." Iphicrates chuckled, a sharp, metallic sound. "I understand what is necessary. That chest there, the one with the gold leaf, holds enough to pay my peltis for a season. But it is currently sitting in a rut and your men are too exhausted to move it. If we leave it, the northern tribes will have a feast before the sun sets tomorrow." He is measuring us, Philip thought, the cold fury in his chest blooming into a dangerous, calculated clarity. He's already deciding what is worth saving and what is meant to be abandoned. "We will move it," Philip said, his voice steady. "We are not leaving a single grain of our pride behind." Iphicrates stepped closer, his eyes scanning Philip's face with a predatory precision. "Pride is a luxury for those who win, boy. I care for victory. If your baggage becomes an anchor that drags this army into a bottleneck, I will not hesitate to cut the rope. Do not mistake my alliance for a vow to protect your furniture." He doesn't fear us, Philip realized, watching the general's gaze drift back to the fleet with an air of clinical detachment. He views us as a variable in an equation, an unstable one that he expects to break. "You speak as if the battle is already lost," Philip replied, turning to finally meet the Athenian's gaze. "But if you cut us loose, General, you lose the only reason this army is here. You are the hand, but we are the heart. Without the king, you are just a mercenary in a land that hates you." Iphicrates' smile did not reach his eyes. "Then keep your king moving, Prince. And tell him that, if the wheels break again, I will not wait for the court to catch up. I will march with the men who can actually walk." As Iphicrates turned to stomp back toward the command tent, Philip watched him go, the general's boots leaving deep, confident prints in the marshy soil. Philip's grip on his blade slackened, his heart hammering against his ribs. The general had laid his cards on the table. He was not a shield, he was a shark, and he was only waiting for the moment the Argead house began to bleed. The sun began to dip, painting the masts of the Athenian fleet in long, jagged silhouettes against the water. The army had successfully connected with its allies, but as the noise of the transfer echoed through the marsh, it felt less like a reinforcement and more like a surrender of independence. The coalition was now physically fused, and as the caravan began the agonizing process of repacking for the march ahead, Philip knew they had become a hostage to the very people who were supposed to save them. Campaign Day 3, en route the third day, dawned under a sky of bruised purple, and the coalition finally dragged itself away from the river's edge. They moved not as a cohesive force, but as a disjointed leviathan, a dense, cautious, and incredibly slow-moving formation. The infantry marched in rigid blocks, while the baggage train of the royal court forced the entire column to adopt a pace dictated by the weakest mule and the most gilded carriage. Philip rode near the rear of the royal retinue, his position affording him a clear view of the command hierarchy in motion. He watched Iphicrates, the Athenian general, as he conferred with the Theban officers. They rode not alongside the Macedonian king, but ahead of him, surveying the terrain as if it were already a map of their own annexation. The Athenian and Theban commanders exerted a suffocating influence over the march, transforming the column into a rigid, soul-crushing machine. They dictated the route with absolute icy authority, forcing the army through narrow, sun-starved defiles that prioritized a defensive posture over speed. a tactical choice that effectively pinned the royal caravan in a moving cage of steel and stone. Whenever Macedonian scouts, who knew the hidden sheep paths and the firmer ground of the higher ridges, suggested a faster, more agile route, the Theban officers had dismissed them with a flick of a hand or curt, audible sneer. To the Thebans, the Macedonians were amateurs, hunted prey pretending to be hunters. Their expressions conveyed the clear, patronizing message that Macedonian experience was merely the frantic scurrying of mountain tribes, fundamentally inferior to their own refined, geometric doctrine of war. Iphicrates, riding at the head of the formation, seemed to delight in the constraint. He kept his Athenian vanguard tightly clustered, their bronze shields gleaming with a uniformity that mocked the straggling, dust-coated Macedonian infantry. If a Macedonian noble dared to ride ahead to scout, an Athenian officer would simply steer his horse to block the path, forcing the noble to fall back into the suffocating belly of the column. The air within the defile grew thick and stagnant, trapped between towering rock walls that seemed to lean inward, mirroring the constriction of the commander's control. Philip, watching from the rear, observed how the commanders turned the terrain itself into a weapon against his people. By forcing them into the low, shadowed gullies, they stripped the Macedonians of their mobility and forced them to look up at their allies looming on the high, rocky edges of the pass. They are training us like beasts, Philip thought, his eyes tracking a Theban officer as he forced a supply-laden mule off the road and into the brush, simply because it had slowed the cadence of the march. They dictate the path, they hold the high ground, and they treat the king's retinue as a nuisance to be managed, rather than a sovereign force to be led. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of authority. Every time the Thebans redirected a Macedonian scout, or the Athenians forced a halt to adjust their own tactical spacing, the message was reinforced. The Macedonians were not partners in this war. They were the baggage, and they would be moved, stalled, and directed exactly as the foreign commander saw fit. They are squeezing the life out of our momentum, Philip thought, his gaze tracking the way Iphicrates scouts deliberately widened the perimeter, pushing the Macedonian household guards further toward the center of the column. They aren't just protecting us, they are isolating us. They keep the king surrounded by their own men, cutting off his access to his own officers, effectively turning his royal progress into a supervised march. He felt a hand on his shoulder, heavy, calloused, and grounding. It was Parmenion. The general didn't look at Philip semicolon. He kept his eyes trained on the Athenian peltas, pacing the ridge above them. They aren't just managing the terrain, Parmenion murmured, his voice so low it was almost lost to the shifting wind in the defile. They are curating the king's reality. Look at the perimeter, Philip. Do you see where the household guards are positioned? Philip squinted through the dust. Parmenion was right. The elite Macedonian horsemen, the ones who knew the king's habits and whispers, had been shifted into a narrow corridor between the supply train and the baggage. They were physically barred from the front. They've cut us off from him, Philip said, a cold realization curdling in his gut. The king is surrounded by Athenian veterans who pretend to be his guards but answer only to Iphicrates. Parmenion's face was a mask of granite, but his eyes were sharp with a veteran's cynical clarity. A king who cannot hear his own men is no longer a king. He is a spectator in his own house. Iphicrates is a master of the geometric trap, but he is a better master of human leverage. By isolating Perdiccas, he ensures that when the time comes to give the final order, or to surrender the ground, only the Athenian voice will reach the throne. And if we tried to break that cordon? Philip asked, his hand drifting toward his side. Parmenion finally turned his gaze to the young prince. His eyes were weary, etched with the experience of 100 lost battles. But there was a flicker of something else, a hidden, dangerous spark. Then you trigger the very discord they are waiting for. They want us to be the ones to break the peace. They want to paint us as the volatile, uncontrollable variable. If we strike out, we justify their protection becoming an occupation. He's teaching me the trap, Philip realized. He knows exactly what Iphicrates is doing, and he's warning me that a direct strike, a display of raw, youthful rage, is exactly what the Athenian wants to see. So we walk? Philip asked, his voice tight. We just continue to be moved like cattle in this cage? We walk, Parmenion replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper as a group of Theban riders trotted past, eyes darting over them. We walk, we observe, and we wait for the moment the geometry fails. Because no matter how perfectly Iphicrates draws his lines on the sand, the terrain always has the final word. When the northern tribes hit this column, the geometry will break. And in that confusion, the king will need to be able to see his own men, not just the Athenian shield surrounding him. Parmenion squeezed his shoulder once, then eased back into the rhythm of the march. Philip watched him go, feeling the weight of the general's unspoken lesson. The march was a cage, yes, but for those who knew how to wait, it was also a place where the guards could be caught off balance the moment the world began to shake. He watched an Athenian officer lean over to a Macedonian noble, gesturing with a gloved hand for the man to pull his horse back and yield the path. The noble, a man who had been a pillar of the Argead court only a week ago, complied without a word, his face flushing a mottled, ugly crimson, a mix of deep-seated resentment and a soul-crushing sense of helplessness. It was a small, quiet humiliation, but it echoed through the ranks like a death knell. "Look at them," Philip mused, the bitterness in his throat turning into a hard, cold resolve that felt like swallowing iron. They act as if the crown is already a relic, a dusty antique they are merely cataloging before the auction. They treat us like the curators of a crumbling tomb, condescending to teach us the proper way to wage war, never realizing that by stripping away our autonomy, they are only sharpening the blade they are handing to me. He studied the Athenian officer's posture, the arrogant, effortless posture of a man who believed his city's history was the only one that mattered. The officer didn't see a prince of Macedon watching him. He saw a landscape to be ordered, a logistical problem to be smoothed over. Philip felt the disparity of it in his marrow. The Athenians were acting out of a practiced institutional arrogance that had survived generations, while he was watching his own identity, his own right to lead, being systematically erased in the dirt of a northern road. The formation groaned onward, a heavy, silent mass of bronze and bitterness. Philip kept his head down, watching the dust kick up from the horses' hooves, memorizing the cadence of the Athenian commands, the specific rhythmic barks that signaled a change in pace, the sharp whistle that coordinated the flank guards. He wasn't just watching, he was auditing their power, tearing apart the mechanics of their control, so he could understand exactly where the pressure points lay. Every mile toward the Haliacmen felt less like a march to glory and more like a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose. The landscape itself seemed to be conspiring against them, the encroaching valley walls pressing closer, forcing the column into a singular, undeniable line. Philip realized that Iphicrates wasn't just directing an army. He was constructing a theater of submission. He was forcing every Macedonian, from the high-ranking noble to the youngest squire, to experience the physical reality of their own irrelevance. But as the dust settled on his boots, Philip felt the cold comfort of the student who had outpaced his master. Let them believe they are the ones holding the leash, he thought, his eyes tracking the Athenian vanguard's blind spots. The tighter they pull, the more they reveal how much they need us to stay within the lines. To be continued in episode 35-1. Battle of the Haliacmen Part 1. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.